IVM.
How would you like to be rewarded for paying your credit card bills on time? Cred gives you the chance to be part of an exclusive club of highly trustworthy individuals where you get cashback and other rewards for being good. Now that's a great policy. So don't miss out. Just download Cred and be part of the club.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Suyash Desai. If you follow Takshashila's China output regularly, then you might be aware that our China desk's head, Manoj Kewalramani, has written recently on China's changing approach to development. In the People's Daily, there have been a series of articles highlighting this. So to understand what are China's new development goals and how they would be implemented and how will they help the PRC in achieving its centenary goal, we are joined by Manoj. As I have already mentioned, Manoj heads our China Studies program and the Indo-Pacific desk. Hi, Manoj.
Hi, Suyash.
Manoj, so what are these new development goals? And before you answer what are these goals, how did you come to know about these goals? Because I believe this is a very recent development, not a new development goal per se, but a change in focus or a shift in strategy, as you have highlighted somewhere else.
Hey, I wouldn't sort of call it a new sort of development. I think this is something that's been evolving over a number of years, particularly after the 19th Party Congress in October 2017. And that's where you get this idea of China entering a new era. That was the big thing from the 19th Party Congress, right? That now you have a new era that you're in. And I think this is a development on that idea that China is in a different phase of its existence, or at least the modern PRC is in a different phase of its existence. And what we've seen is then policies need to be adapted, taking into account firstly understanding what exactly is this new stage all about, how do you adapt to it, and what are the kind of policies therefore that you need to be able to achieve your goals as the party or as the government. So I think that's the first thing that we need to keep in mind when we talk about this idea of something new that's happening. What I think over the years, this is sort of, we've seen in bits and pieces this idea getting crystallized over time. And for some time, Xi Jinping gave a speech a couple of months ago and he spoke about this. And what I saw in the last week in the People's Daily was that there were a series of commentaries, like you said, 4 commentaries under the byline Wen-Hsuan, which talked about the idea of this new development stage, the new development concept, the new development pattern of China, and the new journey. Those were the 4 sort of headline ideas in these 4 very, very long commentaries that came out in the People's Daily. And I think it's important for people to just give them a little bit of context to understand that commentaries in People's Daily tend to be different and serving different purposes. So often there are commentaries in People's Dailies in the People's Daily under different bylines, some of which are people who don't really exist. Those are pseudonyms. Those pseudonyms are used by different entities, different departments, different organizations within the party hierarchy, and those will convey the party's or the department's view on a certain issue. Of this sort of was done, instead of sort of writing down that the party's propaganda department says this and then writing a long note, you give it an individual's name, you do it in the form of a commentary, and that percolates down well to grassroots cadre. It also allows you to do a bit of shadow boxing because no one individual is sort of targeted. So those kinds of things sort of play out. And there's a wonderful paper which I can share in the show notes that people can read, which talks about the use of pseudonyms and the relevance of these bylines at different points of time. So different bylines will talk about different themes at times. For example, Zhongsheng is a byline that talks about China's voice for the world. And largely over the last year or so, we've read Zhongsheng pieces essentially talking about China-US relations and being very critical of the US. And like this, there are sort of many different bylines, right? So Wen-Hsuan is again a byline. I'm really, I still don't have an answer as to who it represents. But from what I understand, it sort of talks about Every time I've seen this byline in the last year, last sort of 6, 8 months, a year, I've seen it used in the context of explaining top leadership perspectives. And this time again, it is what it was used for. We had 4 articles under this byline to explain the perspectives of Xi Jinping with regard to this new phrase, new stage, new environment, and new ideas that he's brought forward.
So, what are the domestic and external situation under which this changes are to be implemented?
So I think if you look at the each of the commentaries that were there were classified under, like I said, different headers, right? So the first one talked about the new development stage. It talked about the fact that this is a phase in China's development which is very, very different from what has been in the past. And the thinking on identifying and defining and describing this phase or this stage of development came about based on certain strategic judgments made by the Central Committee and Xi Jinping at its core. And this definition of this new stage that we are at, that China is at, was arrived at by looking at the world domestic situation from a sort of Marxist prism. And the piece sort of goes into deep lens in talking about the Marxist methodology. It essentially talks about the fact that, look, I'm going to quote some bits here. It talks about how Marxists insist on a combination of ideals and goals and the historical inevitability of different stages of development. And it says that, look, based on China's sort of theory of development and China's practice of development and principles of Marxism and applying all of that in terms of how history functions, we've come to an understanding that today China is still in the quote-unquote primary stage of socialism. The piece quotes Xi Jinping as saying, look, the primary stage of socialism is not a static, unchanging, stagnant stage. It's not a passive stage. It's sort of, to cross that stage, you're going to require a lot of effort. But this is a stage which is sort of still full of vigor, and you're going to do a lot more to be able to leap forward from it. So that's the first thing. He says that, in terms of his sort of overall vision of socialist modernization to 2049, at present you're still in this sort of primary stage of socialism and Marx and communism, and then you're going to take a long time to get forward. So that's the first thing that they talk about the stage. Now, what does this mean practically? Well, it means practically is, let's look at where China is at domestically, and which in sort of popular propaganda, what you will see is that they will tell you that China is sort of on its path for national rejuvenation. And where are we at that path of national rejuvenation? Well, there's lots that needs to be done. China has achieved a lot. Its per capita GDP is now at around $10,000. It's eradicated absolute poverty, at least officially, in terms of science, technology, and innovation. In some domains, it's a world leader. In a lot of domains, it's still sort of there and thereabouts. In terms of core technologies, it's heavily dependent on the outside world, and those are sort of key problems. In terms of the environment and sustainable development, there is lots and lots to do. In terms of governance ability, there is still lots to do. So the idea is that, look, we've done well, but we are still at a stage where there is lots to be achieved if we have to achieve that socialist modernization goal. And again, to achieve that is one thing that we need to keep in mind. The other aspect of this stage is in the context of what's happening in the world. And the idea is that across the world, when you look at it, you're seeing that the global order has entered a period of turmoil and change. There is unilateralism, protectionism, and also hegemonism, which they're essentially referring to the US. And that sort of is a challenge. While there is still globalization, these are sort of key challenges to globalization. They are very sort of, the piece is quite sort of blunt in saying that, while there is momentum on China's side, you're going to see a lot of challenges. There are going to be tremendous headwinds, and that's going to continue. And there are going to be external shocks as China sort of progresses on its path. And that's the new development stage that you're looking at. That there are all these domestic challenges, apart from all the domestic successes that you've had, but externally there are these tremendous challenges, while also keeping in mind that externally globalization is still not entirely lost its sort of salience. And at the same time, you also see that in terms of international institutions, there is a greater opening up of that structure, and China has greater room to maneuver in that structure. So there are positives and there are negatives, and they've identified these positive and negatives, and they're saying that based on all of this, we have identified that this is the new development stage that we are on which we need to perform. And that piece basically says, well, okay, so to go forward, what we need to do is we need to maintain strategic determination. That means keep doing what we're doing, stay steadfast along the Chinese sort of socialist path, and not sort of deviate from that. But be aware that there are going to be tremendous risks, yet there are also going to be tremendous opportunities. And in our decision making, we need to keep in mind long term considerations and not just think about short term thinking and short term sort of gratification. And finally, the idea is that, look, because this is a new development stage, we need to think of a new development concept in terms of our economic approach to the world and our political approach to the world. And we need to think of a new development pattern to be able to satisfy the needs of this new development stage. That's the sort of primary question that they have raised in terms of stage. I'm going to sort of go into the concept a little bit because, and a lot of it sort of repeats what I've already said. But then the author also talks about how, in terms of keeping in mind this new development concept, it's important for China to sort of address bottlenecks at home. This is about, making sure that you're innovating as an economy, making sure that interprovincial, intercity, interdepartmental coordination is much, much better. So you're much, much smoother in governance. You're much, much better in leveraging the strengths of people across the country. You're making sure that development is not unbalanced, which is a key problem that they have. You're making sure that you're addressing issues like income inequality, which are key problems. You're making sure that one of the sort of key aspects of this new development concept is greenness, openness, and sharing. So you've got innovation, coordination, greenness, openness, and sharing. And that's the idea. The argument is that this has been thought through keeping in mind all your domestic requirements, addressing the bottlenecks that are at home, to try and make sure that you're investing in innovation. You're sort of making sure that your governance structure is optimized and you're far more efficient, so that you can maintain steady growth going forward. Your industrial scale gets upgraded. You address, like I said, challenges of inequality and unbalanced growth. You focus on environmental protection as part of your development initiatives, which was not necessarily the case, say, 5, 7, 10 years ago, when GDP was the primary driving factor. And of course, you focus on livelihood issues, so that you don't sort of denigrate the idea. You don't sort of lose track of the fact that at the end of the day, all of this has to upgrade people's livelihood and they need to feel a sense of gain, because if they don't, it hurts performance legitimacy for the party. So that's, again, how you're looking at this new development concept domestically. Internationally, the idea is that, look, there is massive transformation going on. There are lots of challenges, like I said, but there's also the fact that geopolitical and geoeconomic power is shifting from the west to the east. And that's going to remain. And that's, I think, one of the key things that they're asking the carders to keep in mind. That, look, there are going to be tremendous opportunities despite all these challenges that are going to come. And we need to steadfastly keep our head in the game to make sure that at least these sort of internal domestic goals are met and we keep focusing on those. I mean, that's sort of in a nutshell what sort of conceptually the thinking is in terms of the new development concept. I mean, in the pieces that I've done for my blog, you can see that these are sort of outlined in far more detail, where they talk about the changes that are taking place and what needs to be then done. And I think it's really important to understand that there's a lot of domestic imperative here, which I've just spoken about, that the Chinese are talking about addressing. It's not just about the international sort of changes that are taking place.
So Manoj, in your blog, you've also written something about dual circulation, which is one of their key evolving strategy. So how do you explain that? What is dual circulation and what does this strategy mean?
Yeah, so this is dual circulation is something that we started hearing about last year. And actually in the sort of April, May last year is when you started first hearing about something like a new development strategy, whatever that needs to be formed. And eventually the strategy was sort of named dual circulation. So the third piece in the series that I was covering in my blog talks about the new development pattern that China faces. And that's essentially what dual circulation is. I mean, it's a euphemism for dual circulation. What exactly is dual circulation? Good question. Essentially, it's a strategy where you're saying that, look, when Chinese leaders look abroad, what they see is that the world has changed quite significantly. There is, like I said, a shift in economic power from the west to the east that's taking place. And the international market and China's sort of reliance on the international market for its growth, whether it's through exports is increasingly going to be difficult. Now, you can think of this not just in the context of rising wages in China, cheap goods being produced, it's becoming much more expensive to produce cheap goods and to export from China. You can think about it from the point of view of how the external market, so when the West essentially has reacted to China post the pandemic, or even before that, when Donald Trump started the trade and the technology conflict with Beijing, you started seeing challenges emerge in terms of China's external engagement, its trade. You saw sanctions, we saw tariffs go up, and we've also seen restrictions in the external market with regard to Chinese investments. And from Beijing, when you're looking at all of this, you're saying, look, okay, there is clearly something going on which is going to make our external economic engagement, trading engagement, very, very difficult. At the same time, you see that, like I said, there are domestic factors for this also. But at the same time, you see that there is an opportunity in terms of China's rising wealth domestically. We've seen news reports year after year about online sales festivals in China breaking records, billions and billions of dollars worth of online sales. We've seen for over a decade now the Chinese talk about pivoting towards boosting domestic consumption. So this is what Xi Jinping is saying through dual circulation or this new development pattern. He's saying that, look, the world economy has become far more unstable. Plus, and then China's external engagement is far more difficult. Plus, there is our comparative advantage that we used to have in the past in terms of our domestic economy no longer exists the way it used to. It's gradually eroding. And that's not necessarily a bad thing in many ways, because they're also going up in terms of industrial scale and up the value chain. So in that sort of environment, something needs to change, And how do you make that change? Well, from a Chinese leader's point of view, what they're saying is they've decided they need to focus on domestic consumption as the biggest driver of growth. And that's where dual circulation is. So the piece in People's Daily basically says this, right? It says that China's dependence on foreign trade has systematically dropped from 67% in 2006 to nearly 32% in 2019. It's still significant, but it's dropped quite significantly also. And also the fact that since the financial crisis, domestic demand has continued to expand. And this is the financial crisis of 2008. So their assessment is that down the road, the domestic market is going to be the primary driver of China's growth. So that's the domestic cycle. The international market and engagement with the international market is the international cycle. Hence, dual circulation, these two cycles. And how do you manage the interplay between these two cycles? That's predominantly the idea behind this concept of dual circulation. What this means in practice is essentially this, that China will not be shutting down to the world, which is one of the concerns that has been there ever since the idea of dual circulation came about, that China will be shutting down to the world and it's looking at it's becoming much more insular. My reading of this is not that it's not like it's becoming much more insular. Yes, it's going to be focusing on domestic demand. It's going to be trying to cut its dependencies on external actors as much as possible, particularly when it comes to core technologies. Because, and these are Xi Jinping's words also, he's repeatedly said that, that is a problem. And you need to, instead of being dependent on the West, you need to cultivate dependencies through the strength of your market and your innovation and your investments in technology. And that's where dual circulation essentially goes. So in the piece by in the Wen-Hsuan piece, there's a quote where he talks about, where the author talks about how, and I'm going to quote him, "We should promote the construction of a strong domestic market and trading power, form strong gravitational field for global resource factors, promote the coordinated development of domestic and external demand, imports and export, and introduction of foreign investment and outward investment." So look, he's not saying that I want to disengage with the world. He's saying I need to focus on my strengths, I need to cultivate my strengths. And one of the key factors of that is create this sort of strong gravitational field for global resource factors, which is make sure that there is investment with regard to key aspects in China, and engage from that sort of position of strength. So essentially, dual circulation to me is about building interlinkages and attracting high quality investment and spending abroad for technological advancement, along with expanding global engagement and leverage while boosting domestic market size and demand. That's the attempt that they are trying to sort of pull through this strategy. And I think it's really interesting to keep in mind what they are doing and why they are doing, because at the end of the day, China remains deeply integrated into the global supply chains, and that gives its leverage. And if this strategy sort of works out according to what they're thinking, it will place China not only the center of, it will continue to place China not only at the center of global supply chain, particularly with regard to sort of key items, but it will also take it up the value chain in the sort of industrial supply chain, which makes it a much more prominent actor. It gives it much more economic heft, gives it therefore much more political heft around the world. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind in India too.
So, Manoj, now that we have discussed what they are doing, how they are doing, and why they are doing this, how will this change in the strategy or shift in a strategy will help them in achieving the goals that Xi Jinping had set in 2017, starting from 2015, the 2035 goal, the 2049 goal. How will this strategy forward his centenary goals, PRC centenary?
Yeah, I think the objective is that, look, like I said, he wants to address a whole set of issues, which, like I said, go from domestic economic development to issues like inequality, unbalanced growth in terms of different regions, to things like environmental issues, sustainable development. And so that's the first thing, and that sort of ties into his broader sort of long-term goal of achieving socialist modernization by 2049. So that's the first thing, that it tells you that there is a clear idea of what you have to do and what do you want to do domestically from an economic point of view to be able to achieve these goals. This also includes, like I said, livelihood issues with regard to, say, social security nets and things like that, healthcare. And I think it's really important for people sitting in India or elsewhere to understand that the Chinese are not just thinking about regime survival simply through machinations. There's also a very clear thought of what kind of economic development is needed going towards 2049, and where do we need to be in that regard. And I think that's the first thing that we need to keep in mind. So say as early as 2035, there's at least one clear target that we have, right? In last year when they had the fifth plenary session, the target was that you need to double your GDP by 2035. So at least in that you have a target set by the Chinese government. Otherwise, they don't have numerical targets going down to 2049, but you've got this broad vision, right, that we are addressing issues across the board, because we think all of these are strategic imperatives for sort of the party's legitimacy. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is that I think there is a fairly honest assessment that's going on, at least in these debates that I've read, which I think often we sort of get so lost in thinking about propaganda, and there's a legitimate concern about the feedback loop that leadership gets, particularly when we've seen Chinese foreign policy being quite counterproductive. This is quite a refreshing read, these commentaries were, because there was quite an honest assessment of things. So, for example, at one point in time, the author writes that at present, the situation with regard to certain core technologies, which are not controlled by us, has not fundamentally changed. He talks about how many Chinese companies are at the low end of the global value chain, and therefore he talks about the need to sort of push modernization, push self-reliance, and all of that. Now, whether that policy will work out is something to be seen, because being self-reliant in technology while being at the leading edge is very, very difficult, particularly when you are self-admittedly quite low down the value chain. You will need to engage with the world, and you will need sort of talent exchanges. You will need not just investments, but also transfers of technology, and you will need the time to sort of invest in core technology development. But if your foreign policy is not adapting well to these so-called unseen changes in the world for the past century, and it's creating more hostility, which is closing up avenues for commercial research and engagement and collaboration with regard to technology, then how do you achieve this goal? So I think that's a challenge. While there is an honest estimation, there's a challenge, and there's not a critical enough review of whether foreign policy is leading us in the direction that we want to. And I think that's going to be a challenge for China going forward. The idea that you can cultivate dependencies of the world on your market and on your technologies and on your development. I mean, in theory, it's okay. You're going to sort of be able to do that. But China's economic statecraft has already led a lot of people to talk about decoupling. And while decoupling is not going to be something that happens immediately, it's going to take time, but people are talking about doing it and looking at modalities of how to decouple in different domains. Again, that will lead to different problems for Beijing. This is not a short-term issue. This will play out in the next 2, 3, 5 years, 6 years, or 10 years. But that sort of narrows the window for China to do what it wants to do. And I think that's again an area which none of these commentaries have sort of honestly introspected on. So in some ways, there's been some honest introspection about the state at where you are and what you would want to do. But is foreign policy serving those purposes? I don't see that debate happening. And I think that sort of tells you a little bit, at least in these commentaries, I don't see that debate happening. And I think that tells you about the challenge of a system where, the feedback to the leader because of the dominance of the leader can be extremely clogged. The pipelines can be extremely clogged. And I think that's something that, at least I have understood when I've read through these commentaries. But yeah, so in terms, just to answer your sort of goal about how do they go about doing this, I think they have to go about doing this through investments in the different areas they're talking about, making sure that their foreign policy serves these purposes, which at the moment I think, they could do much, much better than what they are doing. And in terms of domestic policy, I think what's positive from a Chinese government point of view is that they've identified what are key issues. But to be able to get party cadres working around that, to be able to break down vested interests, to be able to implement policies, to be able to adapt, that's the kind of challenge that they will face going forward. And I think that's what we'll have to see how that plays out.
Very well, Manoj. So thank you so much for this insightful conversation. We will be sharing the paper that Manoj has mentioned, which helps us to find out the pseudonyms that the department use for communicating their messages through different issues. Thank you so much, Manoj, and thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, thewholetruthfoods.com, and Siet Tires. We really do appreciate the support. So the last year's been tough for all of us, and the second wave of COVID really hit us badly. To help those affected by the pandemic in India, the podcasting community has come together under the Pod for Change banner to raise funds through an exclusive NGO partner, Give India. Join IVM and Pod for Change as we look to make a positive impact in the life of those affected by COVID-19. You can go to tinyurl.com/podforchangeindia, and remember, somebody could really use the help. And now back to the promo. On the Simplified podcast, the gang explains the oxygen crisis happening in the country and tells us the various measures being taken to tackle it. On States of Anarchy, Amsani Hariran talks about how the geopolitical relationships shaped COVID response and the world order. As Indians, we're all familiar with acid reflux or heartburn given the spicy food we consume. On The Habit Coach, Ashton has some simple solutions to counter that. Osama Moria explores the iconic neighborhood of Dadar and tells us its connection to outer space in Postcards from Nowhere. It was Dangle time on The Fighting Goat as hosts Somesh and Arjun were joined by unbeaten MMA fighter and Commonwealth gold medalist Ritu Fogart. The traveling professor Siddharth Deshmukh shares examples of various innovations that came up during the COVID times and helped us deal with this situation. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Do you know Tamil? Tamil puriyuma? Do your children enjoy great stories that inculcate good values? Hi, I am Ravishankar Balachandran and I host the Storytime Tamil podcast. I am excited to share a short story with great moral values every day. Listen to Storytime Tamil on the IVM podcast app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts from.